There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dimensions, a Twilight Zone podcast. I'm your host, Bill Couch, and on tonight's episode, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 20, titled Elegy. This episode was written by Charles Beaumont, directed by Douglas Hayes, produced by Buck Houghton. The music was done by Van Cleve. In the cast were Cecil Kellaway, Jeff Morrow, Don Dubbins, and Kevin Hagen. The original air date was February 19th, 1960, and you can watch this on Pluto TV, MeTV, the Sci-Fi Channel, the DVDs, or the Blu-rays if you have them. And again, I say if you don't, make the purchase. It's a good purchase, and they're not that expensive anymore as they used to be. So, fair warning ahead, there will be spoilers in this episode. If you've listened to me, you know that by now. I go through the entire episode and discuss the whole thing, reveal the twist at the end if there is one, and, we discuss it from there. So if you haven't watched this episode, please pause this podcast, go watch the episode, and then come back and listen to it at your leisure. As always, if you want to leave me any comments or feedback, I welcome it all. You can email me at dimensionszpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's dimensionszpodcast@gmail.com. And I will read any and all feedback you send me. So if you have any feedback about previous episodes or any feedback about upcoming episodes that you want to discuss with me, feel free to email me. I love to hear feedback from the 12 of you that actually listen to me on a weekly basis. So without much more hullabaloo and tomfoolery, let's get into the episode. So here is the opening narration. The time is the day after tomorrow. The place, a far corner of the universe. The cast of characters, 3 men lost amongst the stars. 3 men sharing the common urgency of all men lost, that they're looking for home. And in a moment they'll find home. Not a home that is a place to be seen, but a strange, unexplainable experience to be felt. So, the story opens with 3 astronauts that Myers, Kirby, and Weber that have some damaged instruments and are running out of fuel and looking for a place to set down their rocket ship. And they happen upon this asteroid where they decide to set down, and upon setting the ship down, they realize through their instruments that are still working that the air outside is in fact just like Earth's air, so they can breathe it. So, that's one hurdle out of the way in the realm of being lost in space exploration. So they exit the ship to wind up in a field with a dog staring at a hand pump well and a tractor along with a man seemingly frozen in time, standing holding on to a rake, staring kind of off into the distance. They realize that the dog is not moving and the man is also frozen stiff. So they postulate many different theories, as they do through pretty much the run of this show until the third act. But one of the theories they come up with is that since it's been so long since none of them were alive when tractors were in use on Earth, their grandfathers had to tell them about them and all that, and they saw pictures of them and what have you. They postulated that possibly they went back in time and wound up on Earth 200 years prior from when they took off from it. So that gets quickly debunked when Myers points out that the Earth never had two suns, which seems to be a running theme in the Twilight Zone. If you crash land or if you travel to a different galaxy or a different planet, they always have two suns for some reason, which scientifically is bonkers. But here we are. Again, this was made well before man ever went into space. So, a little leeway is most definitely allowed, especially since, it's a sci-fi television show. I mean, from 1960, we're not talking about, something that was made last year, So forgive them, for they know not what they do. They decide to explore a little more, so they walk a little ways, and they find a man sitting on the bank of a creek fishing. So one of the men runs up to him and asks how they're biting, which is something you would ask certainly 200 years prior to when the spacemen landed on the astronaut, and I guess it's still something that 200 years into the future from that man sitting on the bank on Earth, he would also ask, that sort of thing. And there's also mention of the total war, which was in reference, they made reference to it while talking about the tractor, that, people on Earth used them 200 years ago before the total war, which is basically assuming total nuclear annihilation between the countries on our planet. So at one point, when the man gets knocked over while he's fishing by Kirby looks up at the other two astronauts, Myers and Weber, standing on the bridge, and for some reason, it doesn't actually cut to a shot of the two men standing on the bridge. It cuts to a still picture of the men standing on the bridge, which makes me think either A, that part of the film got damaged in some way or spliced or cut up and was unusable, or there was possibly another scene that took place or another bit of dialogue that took place in there, and it was ultimately decided to be cut out, but they had to give something, to cut to, so they cut to a still picture of the two astronauts standing on the bridge. Given the fact that we've already seen two actors standing as perfectly still as two actors could be in 1960, the fact that they showed a still photo of two men standing on a bridge is kind of funny when you think about it. So at this point, they hear a band playing. So they decide to run along and see if there is actually people in the band. Is the band playing? Is it just music through a loudspeaker? What are they looking at? And they come across this building where there's a room full of completely still frozen people who are all standing and staring up at a man who was just elected mayor of wherever. So you have a room full of these people. They're all standing perfectly still, all of them extras, staring at one man leaning over a balcony, holding his top hat in his hand with a big grin on his face. And, this just confuses the three guys even more. Now it's not just one guy fishing or one guy farming. Now it's an entire room full of 30 to 40 people standing and staring at this man who just won the election for mayor, and none of them are moving. So it's at this point that we get one of the worst pieces of acting in the episode, in my opinion, and it's by Dan Dubbins playing Kirby, who is talking to Myers, and they're again postulating. We're back to postulating now what could be going on, and Myers comes up with the idea that, or maybe it's Weber, comes up with the idea that maybe the time is different on this asteroid than on Earth. Maybe they're moving at their own pace, but it's so slow in compared to how time is perceived by the astronauts that they're on a different time wavelength, or speed, as it were. To which Kirby says, well, that doesn't seem possible, and Myers says, well, look at the hands on a clock. You never see them move, but nevertheless they do move. And then you see Dan Dubbins playing Kirby go over to a clock, stare at it, and then exclaim, this clock has no hands. And then this huge music cue comes in as it's like a big shocking reveal, when in actuality, at least in my mind, and I could be wrong and I could be just nitpicking possibly, but it just always seemed really I hate to use the word cheesy, but it just always seemed like a huge overreact and a huge overacting on the part of Dan Dubbins playing Kirby to have this reaction, because it's a clock with no hands. It's weird, but it's not anything to get in such a tizzy about, I guess. But nevertheless, he does, and he is, and they are, and so at this point, they decide to split up and explore separately, and then meet back in an hour to discuss what they have found and what they have seen. So Myers winds up in this, I don't know if it's a hotel or what it is, but he winds up barging in on this couple that are having some champagne and dancing to a trio of violin players. When you're watching this, the middle violin player has the shakes. He's trying to hold still as best he can, but he's not quite as skilled as the man on either side of him with holding still. So you can see him move more than others in the episode. Then we see Kirby, who finds a beauty pageant where the woman that is crowned the beauty pageant contestant winner is, shall we say, not necessarily the prettiest of the bunch, although not bad looking, but certainly not the prettiest of the ones on stage. So it kind of is kind of a little off-putting in the fact that we've seen a Frozen Farmer, which is no big deal. We've seen a frozen fisherman, which you wouldn't think twice about. And we've seen a frozen guy that just got elected mayor. Again, not something you'd think about. But then you get to the beauty pageant, and you've got this girl who aesthetically is not quite as pleasing, I guess you would say, to the other contestants on stage, but yet she is crowned the winner. So if you're paying attention, you're looking at this with, you're looking at it like, okay, something is slightly askew. Not saying that the not necessarily prettiest of the bunch couldn't win the contest. That's not at all what I'm saying, and please don't take it that way. But it's just a little weird if you really study, if you really think about it, that this would be happening. So that kind of clues you in as to there's some different things afoot here, and it is at this time that we first meet, although we don't technically really meet him at this point, but it's when we first meet Mr. Wickwire, played by Cecil Kellaway. After Kirby screams at everyone that why aren't they moving and why aren't they doing anything or saying anything, and runs away, we see Mr. Wickwire turn around in his chair and kind of give a little bit of a mischievous grin. And so that clues us into the fact that we're not all, the guys are not all alone on the planet, or asteroid, as it were. So the time has passed, and they all have met up now on the back lot of the studios in the subdivision portion. You'll notice the subdivision because it's used in several different episodes, including Third from the Sun and Walking Distance. So if you've seen those episodes, you've seen this little subdivision before. And you'll see it again in many TV shows, many movies, even more episodes of The Twilight Zone as we go further into it. So they decide to go into a house that they're walking past and look around and just, kind of explore a little further. So they walk up on the porch, and there's again a frozen man sitting there reading the paper on the porch, and one of them says, hey, you don't mind if we go in and look around, do you, old timer? And it turns out to be Mr. Wickwire. He drops his paper and he says, oh, absolutely, I don't mind, come on in. So he introduces himself as Jeremy Wickwire and invites the guys into the house. The guys are a little reluctant to go, which is funny because they've been looking for anyone that can speak, talk, hear, understand, or react to them. And then they find a guy that can see, talk, hear, speak, and react to them. And they, are very, very shy all of a sudden, It's kind of funny. So they wind up going in the house with him. And he explains that this house was actually built for a man, but he decided at the last minute, instead of living in that house, he wanted to be a knight and wear a suit of armor and fight dragons. And so he is in the medieval section of the place, slaying a dragon. So they ask what's going on, obviously. Mr. Wickwire explains that he is the caretaker, and they are in a cemetery. He then offers them a drink. They all drink and toast to everlasting and eternal peace. And then he asks them a seemingly innocuous question of if all three of them or each of them individually could be anywhere doing anything right now, where would they want to be? and they all agreed that they would want to be on their ship headed for home. So Wickwire says, "Oh, okay, and when did you leave Earth?" And they told him, and he goes on to explain that while he is the caretaker, he's not actually a human. So he comes on and off when necessary, and he had been off for about 200 years, and now he's back on again, mostly because of their arrival. And he goes on to explain that in 1973, Happy Glades, the name of the cemetery / asteroid that they're on, was created by these two men who wanted to give people that had the means the ability to, after death, be taken to this asteroid and their body put in a place or in a situation or in a time that made them the most happy. So if a guy wanted to be elected mayor, he could be always elected mayor. If a guy wanted to slay dragons, he could be slaying a dragon in a suit of armor. Or if a guy only wanted to just mow his grass, he could mow his grass. As long as he had the money to pay for the shipping and handling of his body from Earth to the asteroid and upkeep, you could do it. So we've stumbled across a futuristic cemetery from the past. So that's interesting. So about this time, after Wickwire has basically explained everything to the three guys, they all start kind of collapsing and struggling to remain alive. And we find out that Jeremy Wickwire, Mr. Wickwire, has given them the Eternity Fluid in the drink, which is going to kill them. Not painfully, he said. It won't be painful, but he will kill them. And we now know why he asked them where they would all rather be if they had their wish. And so, of course, they said, why'd you drug us? And he said, well, because you're men. And as long as men are alive, there will be no peace. And so he had to kill them because he couldn't allow them to live there, because they would just destroy the place. In the whole thing would be for nothing. And so we come to the final shot of the episode, which is Kirby, Myers, and Weber all sitting in their ship at the controls as if they're headed for home. And we see Mr. Wickwire come in with a feather duster and dust them off to then give us the end of the episode. So now for the closing narration. Kirby, Weber, and Myers. 3 men lost. They shared a common wish, a simple one really. They wanted to be aboard their ship, headed for home. And fate, a laughing fate, a practical jokester with a smile that stretched across the stars, saw to it as they got their wish, with just one reservation. The wish came true, but only in the Twilight Zone. So thus ends the episode of Elegy, which I gotta be honest with you, it was one that when I was a kid and they used to show the reruns on WGN when I used to watch them as a child when I lived in Chicago. This one hardly ever, it seems, came up. And even on the Sci-Fi channel when they would do the 4th of July marathons or the New Year's marathons, it seemed like this one, like it wasn't until the mid-90s or even late 90s maybe, that I ever saw this episode the first time, and I always kind of liked it. To me, it's a definitely top middle in the ranking. It's nowhere near the worst episode, but it's nowhere near the best episode. It's a good episode if you want to... It's a low-key episode if you wanted to introduce someone to what the Twilight Zone is all about. You could show them this episode, and it would be a decent one kind of to start with, kind of to dip someone's toes in that may or may not have ever seen the show before or know what it's about. You know, the ability to, you could show them this episode as sort of an appetizer for what would be to come in the realm of the Twilight Zone. So let's move on to bios. Douglas Hayes was the director. If you want to hear more about him, go back to my episode And When the Sky Was Opened, where I discuss his biography. He directs a few more episodes of the Twilight Zone, so we will hear his name again for sure. But if you want to hear more about him, go back to that episode and listen. So the character of Myers was played by Jeff Morrow, who was born in 1907 and died in 1993. He has 73 credits to his IMDb page. He started out as a stage actor and went into TV and movies. He was a well-used character actor in such shows as Lights Out, the Philco TV Hour, and Hands of Mystery. He also appeared in the 80s version of The Twilight Zone, which was actually his last acting role. He basically retired from acting in the late 70s / early 80s and worked as a commercial illustrator, and would take occasional acting roles whenever he felt like he wanted to, which is how he wound up on his last acting role to be in a segment of the 80s reincarnation of the Twilight Zone. So what a way to go out. And of course he passed away in 1993. Now Kirby, the character of Kirby, was played by Dan Dubbins, who was born in 1928 and passed away in 1991. He had 124 credits to his IMDb. Started out in the movie From Here to Eternity and The Caine Mutiny because Jimmy Cagney, Mr. James Cagney, saw this guy and liked him and thought he had a good look about him and started to put him in pictures, and that sort of jump-started his career because at the time James Cagney was quite a name. So it got this man the boost in his career to get him going, where he would be a well-used character actor in shows like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Rawhide, Gunsmoke, Dragnet, and The Rockford Files. He worked until 1983 when he retired, and he died in 1991 of cancer. So unfortunately, he had less than a year or less than a decade after he retired before he died of cancer. So that, kind of sucks. Character of Weber was played by Kevin Hagen, who was born in 1928 and passed away in 2005. He had 128 credits to his IMDb. Well-used character actor again, who appeared in 2 episodes of The Twilight Zone. This one and Season 5's episode, You Drive. He was also used in other TV shows like Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel, Wagon Train, and The Time Tunnel. He was married 4 times, but in between the times he was married, he was a single father to his son, who grew up to be a special education teacher and baseball coach at a school in Bakersfield, California. And he died only, it seems like a short while ago, but 2005 was actually about 18 years ago. But he died in 2005. And on to the man of the hour, Mr. Cecil, or Cecil, if you will, Calloway, who played Jeremy Wickwire. He was born in 1890 and died in 1973. He had 148 IMDb credits to his name. He was a native of South Africa, but spent many years in Australia doing film and television before he decided to try it in America. The first time he tried it, it didn't quite pan out. So he went back to Australia, where he got a call and was offered a role in the movie Wuthering Heights in 1939. That seemed to solidify him in Hollywood, and started his career stateside. He was in 2 episodes of The Twilight Zone, much like Kevin Hagen. Except he was in this episode and in the episode season 4's Passage on the Lady Anne, but always a character actor. He was in shows such as Playhouse 90, Studio One, Rawhide, Ben Casey, and The Donna Reed Show. And he passed away in 1973. So now for trivia. Cecil Calloway said that Happy Glades was started in 1973. Coincidentally, he passed away in 1973. In the original Charles Beaumont story, instead of a beauty pageant, it was a car race, but Douglas Hayes said recreating a car race that doesn't move would just look like a bunch of people sitting in their cars, which he wasn't necessarily wrong. So he came up with the idea, Douglas Hayes came up with the idea of the beauty pageant instead of the car race, which originally didn't sit well with the writer Charles Beaumont, but it is considered one of the more memorable parts of the episode, just because for once the most aesthetically pleasing girl didn't win, and the character of Kirby in no way makes fun of her or degrades her in any way, for not being the prettiest girl on stage, even though she won. The title, Elegy, refers to a song or a poem expressing sorrow for one who has died. So if you knew that going into this episode, you kind of had a leg up on what the episode was going to be about. The Canadian industrial band Skinny Puppy used samples of this episode in their songs 200 Years, Dig It, and Chainsaw. The town hall set, where the guy was elected mayor, is the same set that we used in the 16mm shrine as Barbara Trenton's house, remember, played by Ida Lupino. It was also used as part of the Army Hospital in the Purple Testament, which you heard if you listened to last week's episode. The episode supposedly takes place in the Happy Glades Cemetery asteroid in 2186, and the nuclear war that was supposed to obliterate all of Earth happened in 1985. Of course, the instrument panels and such on the ship are the same ones used for the movie Forbidden Planet, which, if it's anything spaceship related, chances are you're going to have seen it on the movie Forbidden Planet. They paid a lot for those sets, and they were going to get every bit of use out of them they possibly could. So, that's why you see them a lot. The character of Weber was the captain of the ship, and Myers was a professor, and Kirby was, I guess, just the navigation man. They all left Earth in 2185. The spacesuits worn by the men are the same ones worn by the crew in the movie Destination Moon. The music in this episode by Van Cleve, or Nathan Van Cleve, if you will also be used later in the episode 22. And of course, as I said before, this suburban street was used in Walking Distance and will be used again in other episodes of The Twilight Zone, as well as countless movies and television shows. Now for the goofs. As you heard me mention, pretty much any time in Serling's universe that anyone lands on a planet that's not Earth, there are two suns. And in the opening narration, it said that they're, far corner of the universe. One of the characters mentions that they're 655 million miles from Earth, which would put them somewhere between Jupiter and Saturn. So it would be weird that they would look up and see two suns between Jupiter and Saturn. So that doesn't wash. Again, all the people in the episode minus the four main characters are all supposed to be frozen, but you can clearly, if you watch the footage, if you watch the TV show, you can all see them twitching and moving and breathing and all that throughout the episode, even though director Douglas Hayes made it purposely be where whenever there were frozen people in the shot, that he would keep the camera sort of rotating and moving so that you wouldn't necessarily notice the twitches and the slight rocking back and forth of the movements of the people trying to play perfectly still. Although Douglas Hayes probably didn't think in 1960 that people would be watching this episode 60 years later on 65-inch flat screens with HD capability, watching digitally remastered Blu-rays of the episodes that he shot on the Twilight Zone, where you can see every muscle twitch and every out-of-place hair in the entire episode. So here we are. So, people move. You can't really have a whole bunch of mannequins. It'd just be cheaper to pay extras to stand there as still as humanly possible, which is what they did. And the end result was meant to be viewed on a 15-inch black and white TV in 1960, not a 65-inch full HD with the Blu-ray digitally restored. So, you can't really fault them for that, I suppose. And then of course, speaking of goofs, when the one goes to speak to the fisherman and he looks back up on the bridge, and then we see the still shot, it's just a photograph of the two astronauts still standing on the bridge. It's clearly a photograph. So, you kind of, I don't know, like I said, I don't know if that was if there was meant to be another scene in there or some more dialogue or something and it got cut or damaged in some way, they couldn't use it, but we wound up with what we wound up with, and here we are. So let's move on to likes and dislikes. I like this episode, I really do. It's not one of my favorites by any means, but it's also not one of the worst by any means. But I do like it. I think, like I said, I think it would be a good introduction to someone that may have never seen the show to kind of dip their toe in the water of the Twilight Zone to kind of give them a, kind of whet their appetite for what else Rod Serling had in store for us over the course of this entire series. I love the story. I thought it was a great story. Again, written by one of the greatest short story writers that ever lived, Mr. Charles Beaumont. We'll get into him one day. I'm kind of thinking one of these days I might just do a podcast episode kind of doing the bios on some of the heavy hitters of this series, like Rod Serling, Charles Beaumont, George T. Clemens, Buck Houghton, and Bernard Herrmann, to name a few. If you want me to do something like that, let me know. I'm kind of thinking I might do something like that, just because these men, are responsible for the content, of the shows every week, and they always seem to get, we never do a bio on them. It's always about the actors or the director or what have you. So I'm thinking about I might do an episode just on those guys, just kind of give you a little background to all of them. Certainly, if you're interested. If that sounds like something you might want to hear, send me an email. Let me know. I certainly, don't want to do it if no one wants to listen to it, but if everyone wants to hear it, I will gladly take the time to make one happen. So just drop me a line and let me know. So yeah, I like the story, and I like the direction and the cinematography. I even like the people that were supposed to be still but weren't necessarily still. I always get a chuckle out of it, just because, God knows how many takes they had to take, standing there perfectly still, holding a violin or holding a rake or holding their hat out or standing up and staring up at someone and smiling. I bet it could wear on you after 4 or 6, 8 hours in a day, doing that. So yeah. So if they were to remake this episode today, and they said, "Hey, Bill, who would you cast if we made this episode today?" And here's what I would do. And it's going to sound a little weird, but follow me on this. For the character of Myers, I would go with Jerry O'Connell, just because I haven't seen him in a long time. I kind of want to see him again. I always thought he was a decent actor, from when he was a kid on Stand By Me to when he was in Sliders with John Rhys Davies to when he was in Scream 2, I think it was, or 3. It was one of them in the middle there. I always liked the guy. Always thought he was a decent actor, and always wanted to see a little more of him. So put Jerry O'Connell in there as the Myers there. For Kirby, I would put James Vanderbeek, just because I think he's a better actor than Dan Dubbins, for sure. But he actually is a decent actor, although people give him a hard time for being the star of Dawson's Creek and all that. But hey, the man made enough money, he didn't have to do anything pretty much for the rest of his life if he chose not to. So if that's being a loser and being made fun of, I'll be gladly made fun of every day of my life if I could do that. So, you're not hurting my feelings, and I'm sure you're not hurting his feelings by poking fun at him. But he's actually a decent actor, and I would put him in there. And for the character of Weber, I would put Freddie Prinze Jr. just because, again, kind of like Jerry O'Connell, you don't really see him in that much stuff anymore. I always thought he was a decent actor. I'd put him in there. Why not? What do you got to lose? It's an episode of The Twilight Zone. You know what I mean? All they have to do is act surprised, add a little bit of emotion to the character, and go on from there. Can't be any worse than Dan Dubbins, and Dan Dubbins wound up in the episode. So here we are. And then always for a huge actor in a smallish role, for the character of Jeremy Wickwire, I want to see Michael Caine do it, because he has that same sort of demeanor that Cecil Calloway had, that he could be completely wrecking your life and smiling about it, and you'd never see it coming. He has that sort of devious, mischievous sort of way about him, and that is what makes Michael Caine awesome. So, on to the moral and philosophy. This story could be interpreted many different ways. It could certainly be a be careful what you wish for kind of thing. They wish they were on their ship heading for home, and that's basically where they wound up. It could also be a be happy with what you got sort of thing. Certainly, you could see correlation in that. But as we can discover, what it actually was a thinly disguised narrative discussing the effects and the fallout of total nuclear war, which, again, slaps you in the face that it takes place in a cemetery, and it's about nuclear war, which causes, all that. So you can certainly make the correlation. I'm not stretching anything on that by any stretch of the imagination. And the whole, as long as there are men, there will be no peace line, that is certainly smacking you in the face with, the moral or the lesson, I guess you could say, to be learned from the episode. But I think it's a great episode, and it's definitely not one that I will, go up and go into the kitchen and get a snack while it's on, because I'm waiting for the one that's coming on after it. Even though the one that comes on after it, which is next week's episode, is actually one of my favorites. It's not in my top 5. It may not even be in my top 10, but it is definitely a great episode, definitely well acted, and we will hear more about that next week, because in next week's episode, a woman with a quote-unquote good head on her shoulders loses her head and needs help to find it. So stay tuned for next week's episode. The clock on the wall is telling me it's time to go, but before I do, I would like to share a slight piece of listener feedback. And again, if you have any listener feedback you would like to, tell me about from previous episodes, future episodes, episodes that don't even exist, by all means, send me an email at dimensionstzpodcast.com and at gmail.com. I'm sorry, dimensionstzpodcast@gmail.com, and drop me a line. I definitely would love to hear from you. And I did get an email from a friend of the show who's written in before, Mr. Scott Rainey, who said he just got done listening to the episode on The Hitchhiker and loved my modern casting ideas. Well, thank you. I don't just randomly pick names out of a hat. I try to put at least a little bit of thought behind it, at least try to match the character with the actor and that sort of thing. And sometimes it's hard to do. Sometimes I fail. At least maybe, if you liked it, I'm glad you liked it. In particular, he wanted to point out that he, most notably, it was Zac Efron that I chose. That was one of my casting choices. Through this email that Scott wrote me, he tells me about how he actually became a fan of Zac Efron after he transitioned from basically teeny bopper into an actual competent actor, through, by way of his daughter, of course, because children, or especially younger girls, especially back in the High School Musical days, definitely loved some Zac Efron. So obviously, if they love it, you have to hear about it. So so as it goes, he wound up actually becoming a fan of Zac Efron when he saw him in the movie Parkland, which is about the JFK assassination. If you haven't seen it, give it a look. It's actually a really good movie. It didn't get a lot of attention when it came out, but it is actually a pretty good movie. And if you have the time, you should make the time. And most definitely, Scott, you are correct. This is a great movie. And people, if they haven't seen it, definitely should make the time to see it. And with that being said, if you would like, listen, subscribe, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, put it on the bulletin board, tape it to the bulletin board at the grocery store, tell all your friends, neighbors, relatives about it, let them know that this is out here, and we can go from there. And thank you guys for listening, all 12 of you who have listened to me drone on about this 60-year-old television show for so long. I do appreciate you so greatly that you listen to me and that you wait for the new episodes every week. It always amazes me, the 12 of you that actually listen. You actually, listen on the day I release stuff, and it really makes me feel good, to see that, and I appreciate all of you for that. So stay tuned for next week's episode, Mirror Image. Until then, good night, everybody.